thank Enrique for the opportunity of allowing me to organize this workshop as part of the Jornadas of the International Conference of Legal Philosophy. I have a brief introductory words just to share with all of you. So we would like I would like to take 5 minutes while we do the logistics, just to do a warm welcome to our speakers and to thank you all for being here. This is the last session of our International Conference of Legal Philosophy. Has been an overwhelming success, and this is the last workshop in which we're going to talk about legal pluralism. We're going to shift gears from critical legal theory to legal pluralism and relationship with legal theory. So legal pluralism is nowadays one of the key terms in legal, not only in legal studies, but also in legal anthropology, legal sociology, and a number of fields. So it fundamentally deals with new phenomena and new interactions between I'm going to say new as a way in the sense that it has been overlooked, but also it forces to engage with new disciplines, and it has forced to some extent legal theory to deal with law and society, with legal anthropology and so on. But from the perspective of legal theory, it also have led to a suggestion that there are a plurality of concepts of law, and the focus on state law is being misplaced. So legal theory should not only be state focused, and we have to recognize, but in doing so, it challenges widespread assumptions about what law is, how law works, and so on. So is there a contradiction, challenge? What can we do about this interaction between legal theory and legal pluralism? What can we learn? Where are we now? So in order to do that, we have this great panel with 3 wonderful speakers in addition to me. So, and there is a small change of plans. Unfortunately, Professors Alexander Green and Jennifer Hendry will not be able to join us today for health reasons. So we have a bit more time, like 20 minutes per presentation. So our panel, we have four fantastic speakers from different parts of the world that are going to engage with different aspects of the legal pluralism agenda. First speaker is Professor Víctor Muñiz Fraticelli, who is from McGill University, who is the author of a very influential monograph on legal pluralism and an authority, and who has worked in the intersection between law and moral and political philosophy and the idea of different kinds of plurality. Professor Muñiz Fraticelli will be joining us from Montreal, and will present on legal pluralism and the university. Then we have Professor Cormac Amhlaigh from University of Edimburgo, that is also author of an influential monograph on legal pluralism that will present on the pluralist problem. Then Professor Orlando Scarcello, that will present about legal pluralism in the European world. And I will have a final presentation on some rudimentary thoughts about legal pluralism on jurisprudence and the idea of unity. So we will have some space for questions after each presentation. And then I hope we can have some time for a more open debate about what is the relevance of legal pluralism for legal theory, and where do we see or feel changing, if there is any need for that. So our first presenter is Professor Víctor Muñiz Fraticelli from McGill University. So Professor Muñiz Fraticelli, you have the floor.
But thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to explore this topic. And I have to admit that I am going to be completely instrumental in my presentation. These are at best some notes towards two things at once. One, towards a theory of faculty governance and university autonomy that comes out of a specific biographical circumstance that I find myself in since a few years ago. And the other is using that that point of departure to explore the idea of legal pluralism itself, because I think that the university as an instance of a self-governing or ostensibly self-governing body, but a self-governing body that has always found itself in the middle of debates and conflicts between other much more assertively self-governing bodies that attempt to exercise their power upon the university. may lead to some interesting insights into what legal pluralism is and how it manifests itself. So the point of departure for this paper is a book project that I began in the past year about the nature of faculty governance and how we ought to understand faculty governance in the modern university. And the way that I understand faculty governance in the modern university, I like to joke with my colleagues, is in the most reactionary possible way. Namely, I want to go back to the 12th and 13th centuries. I want to go back to the Studium Generale and the structure of authority of the Collegium. I am trying to recreate that history, to re-examine the history from the 13th century until the present day in a way that reconciles it with my current activities as the grievance officer of the newly formed faculty union of the McGill University Faculty of Law. We just came out at the middle of this semester. We just came out of a very long and bitter strike, one of those original strikes, formational strikes, because the university did not want to recognize that McGill professors ought to be allowed to unionize in the university when every other university in Quebec and most universities in Canada are unionized. But what is problematic to me intellectually and personally is that if you had asked me 5 years ago whether universities professors should unionize, I would have said no. And I would have said no for the exact same reasons that I think today they ought to do so. I would have said no because I want to go back to the 12th and 13th centuries. And 5 years ago, I would have thought, well, in the 12th and 13th centuries, we were not employees in any relevant sense. We were a self-governing guild, and that is the way we ought to conceive of ourselves. But over the last few years, including, of course, several years of the pandemic, many of us realized, much to our shock and to an existential crisis of sorts, that we were regarded and treated as employees by officers of the university who themselves, although they are drawn from the body of the professoriate, are in fact responsible not to the professoriate, but to the legal person, which in the case of McGill is the Royal Institute for the Advancement of Knowledge. That's the official name of the university, and who are both appointed and remain in their posts only at the pleasure of a board of governors, which is itself not composed by academics. So there is an institutional disjoint from the historical understanding of the university grounded in that 12th and 13th century conception. And that historical disjoint means that the claims to self-governance as they had been formulated no longer apply. That means that if we are to assert university self-governance, we must do so through some other kind of institution. Now, why does this lead to a discussion of legal pluralism? Well, one very easy answer is that I've written a book about pluralism, and once you have a hammer, the world is a nail. So everywhere you look at an instance of an institution, a claim of institutional autonomy, it must, of course, be pluralism. But I don't think that's actually true. I think that there may be claims of very strong institutional autonomy granted to entities that nonetheless exist within the same legal system, within the same legal structure. In fact, there are plenty of delegations that don't quite amount to devolutions, don't quite amount to complete recognitions of a separate legal order that is in some way truly autonomous from the general order from which it springs. So I think that a claim about the university being an instance, or the university having, I'll just put it this way, having some important relation with legal pluralism, the paradigm of legal pluralism being able to explain the autonomy of the university and the place of faculty governance within that university, it requires more explanation. Legal pluralism is not strictly necessary for an argument about faculty governance. We can find other grounds on which to base the centrality of professors governing a university. whether they govern the university in that 12th and 13th century mode by directly electing their directors and not having them appointed by an external board to which they do not respond, which is the norm in the United States and Canada. Whether they have autonomy because they establish their own rules of internal governance, for example, the rules for adjudication of degrees or the rules for the curriculum, which in most cases is respected, even if state institutions, for the most part, and occasionally religious institutions, assert the argument in principle that they could intervene if they wanted to. So it's possible to ground this on other theoretical foundations that are not pluralism. Subsidiarity is one example, which, although it's more of an ethos than a jurisdictional bar, can nonetheless apply. We very often think that the university departments, for instance, ought to govern most of their curricular decisions because it is, from the perspective of subsidiarity, the closest entity along two axes. First, the immediate institutional axis of the institution. It is the entity with which the professor and the students in that department tend to interact the most, but also from the perspective of the discipline, it is the instantiation of an academic discipline in a particular university institution. So there's all these different ways in which we can do so. Why focus on legal pluralism? I think there's three reasons. I think one of them, and the one that I will focus on today the most, is genealogical. That is, I've taken to justifying the continuity from the 12th and 13th centuries to the present day, which is the continuity from the conception of the Universitas, of the effective guild governed by a collegium in the 12th and 13th century, mainly at the universities Bologna and Paris, to the faculty union today as the way to recapture that self-governance, to recapture an entity that represents professors and only professors, and which can assert the claims of professors in a governance structure that is very often oppositional to it. And I've decided to apply the philosophical method of genealogy to try to reconstruct what the university is, what the social practice of a university is. And in that sense, I think legal pluralism serves a very useful purpose. Faculty governance, which is what I'm interested, originates both in legal pluralism, that is, in a legal pluralistic context, that of the medieval constitutional order, and is an exercise of legal pluralism. It is, faculty governance originates as legal pluralism, because historically you see that the university is in fact self-organized even before it gets sanction from the general powers of empire and papacy and the more regional powers of kings and towns, etc. The other two reasons to focus on legal pluralism are descriptive. There is an argument to be made, and I think it's a contested argument. Tabanaha, for example, contests it, that faculty governance ought to be properly characterized as law, that the rules of universities ought to be characterized as law, that they are independently grounded, that they are exercised as or against state law. And then there is a prescriptive argument, which is the claim that, well, they ought to be, even if they are not currently so exercised, they ought to be pushed in that direction. I'm going to leave those two aside for a moment. I'll skip over a bit of my theoretical framework. Jorge mentioned the book that I wrote on pluralism, which is only partly about legal pluralism. It's also about value and political pluralism. But there is some discussion in that book of what I think is the general account of pluralism in all normative theories. And there's a more contentious claim that I make that at least my version of pluralism is perfectly continuous with legal positivism. It is simply a plurality of legal positivistic claims by different kinds of entities, which makes it, I think, a more conservative pluralism in that sense. I do believe that law has certain criteria that, although they're culturally constructed, are nonetheless identifiable and mutually intelligible among those things that understand themselves as legal systems. So a legal system recognizes another legal system, and it recognizes it because it is intelligible to it as a legal system. mainly because it is exercising some kind of authority. It differentiates itself institutionally from other practices. It has something like legal officials, and makes some kind of what I call a meta-jurisdictional claim. Well, I follow others in calling it a meta-jurisdictional claim to set the limits of its own authority. I think universities do that, and I think they do that today, and I think they do that today mostly because they see themselves in continuity with those 12th and 13th century practices. I'll give some examples that I give in conversation with other scholars, and that I do not give in conversation with with state officials who govern the university. For example, there is a requirement in Canadian law applicable directly and explicitly to the university that there are two candidates for a faculty position and they are equally qualified. The position ought to be offered to the Canadian citizen or permanent resident. I have never seen the legal requirement of Canadian citizenship or permanent residency brought up, even in passing, in the context of a university hire. It does get brought up if the candidate is eligible for certain bursaries or other fundraising opportunities. But in terms of their qualification for the professorial position, universities are, in an anachronistic definition of the term, universal, in that they look for a candidate no matter where they are, and they have very little allegiance to the country where they are situated. This, of course, varies between one country and another, and it varies perhaps between universities that see themselves as having a global projection and those that see themselves as serving more their local community. But at least in Canada, we call U15 universities, which is roughly the equivalent of the American R1 universities. You just don't care where someone holds their citizenship. You only care where they got their diploma, and you do discriminate quite abruptly on grounds of degree, but you don't discriminate in terms of nation. This is an exercise of an exception from law, but it's not just an exercise of an exception from law because you disregard the law because you don't care about it, or you disregard the law because you're making an assertive act of disobedience. It is rather because you believe that the norms of the academic community supersede those of the nation state that granted those considerations in the first place. And I think that academics do this all the time. And they've been doing this since, to keep hammering on the point, the 12th and 13th centuries. They've been doing it, and you see this through the emergence of the university as an instance of legal pluralism. The university, especially in Paris and Bologna, who are the two models from which the universities in Europe emerge, they emerge first as private schools. The University of Paris is famously originates in the quite physical migration of Abelard, Peter Abelard, and his students to the other side of the River Seine, to the left bank of the Seine, where on the mountain of Sainte-Geneviève, Abelard establishes his own private school. But eventually the university is constituted, or that which will become the University of Paris is constituted by the agreement of several scholars to band together into an universitas, that is, as a corporation, a term they take from Roman law, which doesn't mean anything resembling an academic institution in Roman law, but which these students of, among other things, Roman law, theology, and medicine, see themselves as constituting a collegiate body where all the members are bound to a common agreement and a common norm, in line with the guild system that was applicable to almost every profession in the medieval order. It is self-organized, and it is self-organized on the basis very often of a law that is not the law of any particular place, but is a law that legal scholars and their students voluntarily subscribe to because they consider it of a higher status or caliber or rationality than any other. Roman law was not the law of any place. It was a law that was effectively created by students of Roman law referring to each other as authorities, very often against their local authorities, and eventually convincing enough cities and kings to subscribe to these norms of royal citation, of Roman citation. It is only in the 13th century, about 100 years later, that you get specific criteria for what a studium generale implies: universal admission, having one of the higher faculties, not necessarily all of them, law, theology, and medicine, and being taught by masters and doctors. And finally, the key element was the jus ubique docendi, that is the ability to have your degree recognized elsewhere. So that's one part, the historical precedent that says the self-organization and the self-imposition of norms, which we have evidence of in part because of the instances in which these norms were suppressed by local authorities, where the Bishop of Paris, for instance, excommunicates the doctors of the University of Paris for having dared to set norms for themselves without seeking the approval of the bishop. And eventually the Pope comes to help to exonerate the doctors and scholars of the University of Paris from that excommunication. The University of Bologna creates an artificial citizenship for the scholars, and only later gets confirmation of that artificial citizenship through imperial protection in the Authentica Habita in 1155. The University of Paris exercises its authority against both the town and the monarch after the Calendar Day riots of 1229, which led the University of Paris scholars to collectively, professors and students, take up their books. And this is, I learned this recently, that there's a Spanish phrase, agarrar los bártulos, which at least in Puerto Rico means just grab your stuff and leave. Well, the bártulos are the books of Bartolus that you would throw on your back and move to another town. And it is against the city and against the monarch that they organize themselves and eventually strike and move out of the city. And it is the intervention of the Pope that, through a grant of privileges, gets them to come back. So you have this self-organization on one side, and then you have on the other, and here's where I think there's a lesson from the university to legal pluralism rather than the reverse, and I'm almost done, that this self-organization, because it is quite limited in its efficacy, because there are very few moments in the history of the university when the university can exercise its authority physically, coercively over members without the aid of some external authority. Most of the self-organization of the university, most of the exercise of the university as an instance of pluralism occurs in an interstitial way. That is, it occurs in the space that is created because of the pluralism of the surrounding society, because there is a pope or a king or a town on one side and some other authority on the other. The university can negotiate the space between them and exercise a kind of institutional autonomy, either oppositionally, that is by siding with one against the other. That's how you get the Authentica Habita, or how you get the Parens Scientiarum for Bologna or for Paris, respectively. Either in a kind of exilic way, by physically removing yourself. This is what happens in Paris. It's what happens with the University of Cambridge, which is an exodus from the University of Oxford. It's what happens in Bologna, where one of the most important rights that the Bolognese professors wanted to retain was the capacity to leave and to take the studium with them, as a way to put pressure on the university, on the town, that is. Or it can be interpretive, that is, as ways in which the university takes the norms that are given to it and that correspond to it, and effectively interprets ways to apply them in ways in a manner very much contrary to the manner in which they were intended by Pope, Emperor, Town, or King. I'll stop here.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find the button to raise my hand. Thank you so much, Victor, for this presentation. It is extremely fascinating. I don't know where your historical overview stops. I was thinking of how much I recognize of the word you're describing today, and I could find a little. I work in continental Europe, so maybe there are some differences compared to North America, but still. And in my mind, considering the places I've worked on, which are again all continental European countries, there's always a moment, normally during the 19th century, in which state takes over and incorporates the word you're thinking of and you're describing into the law of the state. My question would be whether you get to that as well and you explain how it happened. And secondly, if you do, how much of what was before regulated autonomously survives the great incorporation? Thank you so much.
Yeah, so that's a really great question on two different grounds. One is the geographical ground, the difference between the development of universities in Europe and in North America, and even in Canada and the United States, there are some interesting differences. And the other, the genealogical question of how much survives, because it is possible that everything may have been lost. The 19th century is extremely important, and usually, at least for American and Canadian universities, the inflection point is Alexander von Humboldt's reforms to the educational system in Germany. The reason why those are important to the United States and Canada is because American public universities took that Humboldtian university as their model, and some private universities to some degree as well. You see some influence at the University of Chicago, for example. But for the most part, the American public universities are creatures of the state. They're established by the state for purposes that are very often inscribed in their name. The Texas A&M University, it's about agriculture and mechanics. It's about teaching agriculture and engineering in order to spur economic growth. But even within Europe, there is significant variation. So a lot of the historians who are 19th century historians, Rational Hastings is the main one. There's also a wonderful series of books on that update that account. But really, it's amazing that Hastings, writing in the 19th century, has not really been improved upon that much. He says that the Paris model, which serves as the model then for Oxford and Cambridge, and through that for a lot of the early pre-19th century universities in North America, the Harvards and the Yales and the Princetons, is the University of Masters. And you still have, in principle, a lot more faculty control and faculty autonomy, very often coupled with a significant endowment that allows these universities to escape the direct control of the state because they have as much money as many states. On the other, the Bologna model, which is the University of Students, because it was really a faculty union that starts the University of Bologna, where to some degree in Spain, but more in Italy, there was a lot more student directiveness. And sometimes the intervention of the state was at the behest of having the university embody the national ethos that was being created in the 19th century. So that is something that I plan on addressing eventually. I haven't addressed it in this up to this point, because what I'm trying to get to at this point is that original idea, and that's where your other question is very relevant. That it's what remains of this. I think, and here it's been a rather controversial statement when I've presented it elsewhere, that even when the state creates a university or when the state takes over a university, they are creating something that has an independent history. So if the state creates a think tank, an institute, a commission, that institute commission can have as its goal the pursuit of truth, can have as its goal the transmission of knowledge. But if the state creates a university, it is creating something that has a historical trajectory, and that historical trajectory includes the fact that the university, contrary to all these other institutions where people with professional preparation and intellectual aspirations can function in, is defined as a self-governing community of scholars. So the university can create a self-governing community of scholars, but if it tries to intervene directly into the autonomy of that self-governing community of scholars, it has ended up creating something other than what it intended to create. So ultimately, there is a normative. I mean, the whole purpose of the project is a normative project. It's to justify the self-governing community of scholars finding whatever just like in the 12th century, finding whatever institutions will work today so that they can assert their autonomy. And I think that the institution that works today in the Canadian and American context, at least, is a trade union model. But I think it comes down to trying to define what a university is, and that allows me then to say, well, the state can do a lot of things, and it can even create and fund a university. But if it's going to fund a university, it's not at total liberty to decide what the structure of that university will be. Otherwise, it's creating something different.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take my dictatorial power to ask two questions. So one is about the model. I agree. I'm very sympathetic with the 12th century model of university. But my wife is a university administrator. And she shows like, this is just profs being self-serving. They just want to keep control. So you need administrators, so I would like to ask, what is so appealing? I mean, how do you justify, particularly to university administrators, to staff that is not academic, like what is so appealing of the let's call it the classical model of university? That's one question. And my second question is more theoretical in nature, about universities as authorities. So we have authorities which are practical, authorities which are theoretical, if we want to follow RAS. Practical authorities are typically based on effectiveness. So I have control of this population, territory, whatever. So this is why I have a right to rule. But university has claimed a right to rule, not only over themselves, but a right to exclude the other authorities, but not based on effectiveness. It's based on, it's like we're a theoretical authority. Because we're a theoretical authority, we have a right to exclude others from, which seems to be like a distinctive kind of practical authority from the ones we are used from, I don't know, from the Russian understanding of things.
So Raz is famously ambiguous about what actually constitutes the grounds of your, or how the criteria are met. Like the normal justification principle, of course, it seems quite commonsensical. You're more likely to comply with reasons that apply to you in any case if you follow the authority than if you follow your own criteria. But of course, Raz thinks that no actually existing state, and perhaps no actually existing authority actually meets those criteria. He's in the bizarre position of having written a book that is essentially a response to an actual anarchist, to Robert Paul Wolff, but ending up in an anarchistic position nonetheless. I think that there are, my solution to this is to say there are some instances in which academics exercise authority because they are theoretical, and there are some instances in which they exercise authority in ways that are not dependent on their theoretical authority. So I think, to take the department as an example, the department, which is organized around a specific discipline, is the perfect instance to justify the authority of faculty members on the basis of their expertise, on the basis of their theoretical authority. And whatever practical authority a professor has in the context of establishing curricular criteria for the earning of a degree, it is because they know the discipline better than someone from another discipline. So that's one axis in which I think the department intersects with the discipline. The department intersects with the specific university, with a specific institution, say McGill or UNAM or any other university, in another way that doesn't seem dependent on theoretical authority. And I think that professors sometimes try to justify the autonomy of the specific university on the basis of their theoretical authority, they know the academy better. And I think that's actually quite flimsy. I think it's quite flimsy for two reasons. One of them provided by your wife, that there are other actors, there are other stakeholders in the university structure. And this is, in fact, the justification for the university administrators not being agents of the faculty, but rather being agents of the institution who have to balance the interest of the students, the interest of the alumni, the interest, et cetera. That's the famous Charles Kerr model of the multiversity, which is where the university administrator is seeking essentially three things: sports for the alumni, sex for the students, and parking for the faculty members. That is, they have to respond to all of these very banal desires. I think that the justification of faculty authority over the university institution is actually based on status. So in that sense, I can wholeheartedly accept that this is faculty members asserting their special status to govern themselves. So what your wife says about your suspicion, her suspicion is in fact absolutely correct. I think that there are ways, however, to recognize that status and how that status has defined the institution of the university in Europe, while at the same time protecting some of the other bodies. For instance, the original constitutions of Alcalá de Henares that Cardinal Cisneros establishes in the early Renaissance provide, and Alcalá is interesting because Alcalá is the first university that has a town designed around it. So it is a college town designed to sustain the university itself. And we can see some of the effects in the United States. I mean, I did my undergraduate degree at Cornell, and Cornell is a feudal autocracy. The university exercises dictatorial powers over everything else. It's the largest employer. It's the largest landowner. In Alcalá de Henares, you had the election of the administrators only by the bursaries of the university, and you could not be a bursary of the university if you were a resident of the town. So it was designed to exclude the townspeople from the governance of the university. But it also imposed an annual visit by a visitor. And that visitor could hear the appeals and had effectively administrative power to remedy the situation. I think, for instance, that graduate students should have their own unions because they don't have identical interest to the professoriate. Undergraduates should have faculty undergraduate associations that recognize and allow them to exercise autonomous activity as well, because they don't have the same interest. So I in that sense, I'm a pluralist all the way down, in that I think that not by this pretense of an administrator who can reconcile all the interests, but rather by a much more clearly delineated oppositional structure between the different kind of estates within the university structure, with, of course, preeminence given to the faculty, because that's the point of a university's existence, but nonetheless with other institutions that can check the faculty in an important sense.
Thank you so much. This is truly fascinating, and it's also telling that we are in the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. So thank you so much. And in the interest of time, I'm going to invite our next speaker, which is Professor Cormac Amhlaigh, that will present about the pluralist problem. So Cormac, please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. Muy buenas tardes a todos. Aquí en Edimburgo son las 6:30 de la tarde. Desafortunadamente tengo que continuar mi discusión en inglés, pero muchas gracias por la invitación, Jorge. Just another point I wanted to make. I haven't been conducting an orchestra. I feel like Gustavo Dudamel over here. The reason I'm dressed as I am is that I came directly from the University of Edinburgh's graduation hall, where our PhD students and master's students were graduating this afternoon. So that is why I don't usually present like this. Okay, so So Jorge asked me to speak about legal pluralism in a kind of a general sense and give some kind of background. So I've just kind of put together some comments to contribute to the discussion. I apologize if some of them are perhaps a bit banal or a bit well known, but I thought maybe it'd be worth bringing them out for the purpose of discussion. So the brief I got was the idea of legal pluralism as a kind of a new frontier of legal theory in a sense, or raising new questions about law and concepts of law and those kinds of things that those of us who work in legal theory usually engage with. But of course, the history of legal pluralism is very old. The fact of legal pluralism is as old as humanity itself, right? There's always been normative orderings to the extent to which norm governed, orderings to the extent to which humans have interacted in some sense. And then there have been more institutionalized, of course, with the Roman Empire and the legal pluralism there, the Aztec Empire senior in Mexico. So legal pluralism as a phenomenon, as a social phenomenon, is as old as humanity. It's not a new idea at all. I think where legal pluralism starts to become a thing, as the kids say these days in English, is once we move from sort of, I don't want to say obsession, but a dominance of natural law thinking to a more kind of sociological, positivist conception of law. And this is where I think we really start to see legal pluralism taking off as an area of inquiry, as perhaps a distinct area of inquiry in legal studies and legal scholarship. It tracks in many ways, I think, the rise of legal positivism. So if you think of the work, for example, of Eugen Ehrlich in the Austrian Empire, who was, of course, a contemporary also of Hans Kelsen's, this idea of legal positivism and legal pluralism seemed to go hand in hand, because they started thinking about, well, we're not any longer trying to fit our concepts of law to fit some sort of superstructure of natural law, but legal or law properly so called, is very much a social phenomenon, and we can see it around us all of the time. And that's exactly what Ehrlich, I think, was trying to track in his Verkhovnia, his analysis of Verkhovnia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think it tracks also this rise of positivism. And then in the Anglophone and Francophone world, it started to develop further in a kind of post-colonial era, also to an extent in Latin America as well. But we get sort of French or Francophone and Anglophone anthropologists speaking in legal pluralist terms, because they're trying to make a distinction or point to phenomena that aren't captured by the law of the colonial metropole. So particularly in Francophone and Anglophone Africa, where you had the colonial authorities imposing their law, which is often frequently an extension of the law of the colonial metropole or the imperial metropole, and seeing that this coexisted with other forms of normative ordering, and that this is something that should be tracked and should be documented, and the concept of law itself shouldn't just be collapsed into the official law of the colonial metropole. And then there was, I think Ralph Michaels has talked about in terms of waves. The second wave is the sociological wave, where legal pluralism then was extended to social phenomena, sort of anywhere and everywhere all of the time. All sorts of social orderings between gangs, associations, religious institutions, and so on. And that's, I think, how we see legal pluralism today, or at least my reading of the landscape of legal pluralism is very much in that very open, capacious way of thinking about law and legal pluralism. I want to just quickly classify how I see the current state of legal pluralist scholarship. And I see it in three distinct categories. I think there's weak legal pluralism, moderate legal pluralism, and strong legal pluralism. So I'll just quickly outline them, and then I'll go into more detail on each category. So the first is weak legal pluralism. So this is a form of legal pluralism where anything can be law, or any norm can be law properly so called, provided it is validated and recognized by state law, right? So this is where law is essentially, or non-state norms are tolerated by the state. So we have lots of examples of this. For example, indigenous norms could be recognized and validated and enforced by state courts. And by dint of that fact, then they become law. it's not really a form of legal pluralism. In some ways, it's a form of monism, but at least there's a recognition that there are types of normative orderings that are not necessarily reducible to state law. The other form of legal pluralism is, I think, moderate legal pluralism. And this is the idea that we can have lots of coexisting multiple legal orders operating side by side without necessarily any sort of arrangement between them in terms of hierarchy. So it's a move away from what I've identified as weak legal pluralism. But it's still in some ways beholden to state law, because many of the theorists who talk in terms, they don't talk in terms of moderate legal pluralism, but the types of theorists I'm talking about here often draw on concepts of law and concepts of legal systems that have been devised in respect of state law. And then finally, there's strong legal pluralism. And this is really any norm-oriented practice anywhere existing in the world where any kind of groups come together and their interactions are governed by norms. We could even think of friendship, for example, in this context as a form of legal pluralism. But then, of course, it can get more institutionalized. So we can have associations, sports organizations, and so on. And this is a strong form of legal pluralism because it doesn't really have any no direct relationship to the idea of state law or official law or formal law. So it's all law in a sense, right? Provided we have sort of norm-guided practice and norm-guided interactions between different agents. So I just want to speak to some of the features of these three categories, and I want to speak to the advantages and disadvantages of each. And then towards the end, I just want to speak about a little bit about maybe a future kind of research prospectus, or those of you interested in legal pluralism, maybe future trajectories of legal pluralist research that I think are ripe for further inquiry and interesting, at least to me. So if we start with strong pluralism, so that was the last category I mentioned. This was the idea that law is really any kind of norm-based interaction between agents anywhere, regardless of context and regardless of where they find themselves. And so this form of pluralism, I think its advantages are that it's very capacious, right? It captures many law-like forms of practice, regardless of context. So if we think about legal pluralism as trying to, I think Jorge in your preliminary comments talked about, the obsession with the state, and I'll go on to talk about this, but the idea that, state law, if we just focus on state law, we're missing out so much of what's going on in the world, right? We're really not tracking or capturing so many interesting forms of interactions, norm-based interactions, that particularly as legal scholars, we should be looking at and we should be trying to investigate. So if that is a problem, then I think strong pluralism responds quite well to that problem, because really because it's such a broad understanding of law and legal ordering, it allows us to identify law-like types of interactions anywhere in the world going on at any level of human organization in a way. So in that way, it's very open, and it really helps us track a lot of things that maybe more narrow conceptions of law focus on the state do not. I think the disadvantages of the strong pluralism, however, are, well, one of them in particular is its kind of analytical vagueness, right? This form of strong pluralism is not very clear on what's legal about the pluralism. So because it's so open and because it tries to include so many different types of interactions within its broad rubric, it struggles to tell us what law is, or perhaps more interesting, what is legal about this type of pluralism. So it's often not clear the kinds of things that are tracked under strong pluralism, what is specifically legal about these interactions, as opposed to the other forms of interactions that we could have in society. I think one example of this is Brian Tamanaha's famous work, which many of you will be familiar with, and his folk conception of legal pluralism. And I put him in the category of a strong legal pluralism because of the way he defines law for the purposes of his project. And I think the way he does this is problematic. Either it's question begging or it's nominalist. So for Tamanaha, in his earlier formulation of his folk conception, legal pluralism was whatever people in a social arena conventionally recognize as law through their social practices. And so this, I think, is quite obviously questioned by, so what do we mean by conventionally recognized as law through the social practices? What concept of law is doing the work there? And how do I identify these types of social practices that are to qualify as law in the absence of some perhaps more specific definition that helps us pick out those types of social practices that are distinctly legal, as opposed to other types of social practices that we could have. In his later formulation, he talks about whatever different groups call law. So he develops this kind of, it's really kind of an anomalist account of law. So law is anything people call law. And again, you can see the problem here, because this really, I think, in some ways fails utterly to pick out what is distinctively legal about types of social practices when law becomes so almost devoid of content. It purely becomes whatever people name things to be law. Of course, some of that will be things that we might intuitively consider legal, but it might capture many other things that seem to stretch the idea of law. So the disadvantages of strong pluralism, I think, are its radical over-inclusiveness, and maybe its failure to really pick out what's distinctive about legal practice and legal pluralism, as opposed to other types of interaction practices and other types of pluralism, indeed. Moving on to weak and moderate pluralism, which are the first two categories I mentioned. And so weak and moderate pluralism I put in the same category because they do draw on similar conceptions of law, and I'm going to explain that. So weak pluralism, as identified, are the types of legal systems that were associated with states, and the most famous ones that we are all familiar with, and we've already had a discussion about in the earlier session from Hart, Kelsen, Dworkin, and others. And what moderate pluralism does is it takes those conceptions of law and then tries to apply them to other non-state contexts. So the primary type of author that I'm putting in the moderate pluralism category is someone like Neil McCormick, who was a colleague at Edinburgh University. And what Neil McCormick did in his account, he didn't call it moderate pluralism, but what he did was he took these classical definitions of Kelsen, Hart, and others, particularly Hart, because of course he was a student of Hart at Oxford, and developed his institutional theory of law, which was very similar to Hart's account, but then went on to apply it to non-state legal systems. So international law being the classic example, but also he talked about it in terms of canon law, the law of the European Union, and all sorts of other types of legal regulation. But crucially, the concept of law that he was using there was the concept that had originally been developed in the state by H.L.A. Hart. So that's why I put them in the same category, even though they are slightly distinctive in, I suppose, in the horizon that they look at. So weak pluralism focuses almost exclusively on the state, whereas moderate pluralism takes that state-based conception of law, or at least a conception of law that was developed in the state, and starts to try and theorize other types of normative orderings, non-state normative orderings, using that conceptual toolkit. So then what are the advantages? Well, I think the advantages of weak or moderate pluralism are the advantages are the strengths of this form of pluralism is the disadvantage or the weaknesses of strong pluralism, and that is the analytical clarity. So because they rely on these analytical concepts of law, which, you know, from Kelsen, Hart, and others, tend to be quite clear in terms of the necessary and sufficient conditions for a conception of law, they give very, very, well, reasonably clear, I would say, accounts of what they mean by law here and what they understand law to be. And this helps us, I think, in terms of legal pluralism, to pick out law as a distinctive social practice, distinctive from others. And this in many ways was, as I understand, Kelsen's mission in his pure theory of law to say, look, we can have lots of social phenomena, that's fine, but I want to just, in my pure theory of law, try and pick out what's distinctive about law as a phenomenon, and not sociology, and not religion, and not custom, and not other things, right? So in many ways, it's kind of not surprising that these weak and moderate pluralist accounts give us, in many ways, that analytical clarity, because that was primarily what many of its authors set out to do distinctively. The disadvantages of weak and moderate pluralism are the strengths of strong pluralism. So it tends to be very state-centric, as I've just outlined. I don't think state-centrism is a problem in itself. Joseph Raz, in his late work, when he started considering questions of legal pluralism, actually, I think if you read Raz, going back to the beginning, he had a kind of peripheral concern with legal pluralism. I didn't necessarily call it that, but particularly in his later pieces, Why the State, and others, he, I think, makes a fair justification as to why state law has dominated analytical jurisprudence and analytical legal theory. And his point was to say, look, the people who were writing, Hans Kelsen in Vienna, H.L.A. Hart in Oxford, were interested in the phenomenon of law. And when you're interested in something like that in a field, then you're going to start with the most obvious exemplar of that phenomenon that you can see around you and that you're familiar with. So if you're writing in kind of, I don't know which Austro-Hungarian / Austrian Republic, Vienna, then, the state is the most obvious and most powerful, most immediate form of law that you're encountering. So that's kind of natural. You'd be drawn to try and theorize that as an example of law. And similarly, if you're living in Oxford in the 1950s and 1960s, similarly, state law, municipal law is going to be the most obvious exemplar of the type of phenomenon that you're looking at. So I think I agree with Joseph Raz that this state centrism isn't in itself a problem for those people. So for Kelsen and for Hart, I think the problems emerge when they go on to make another claim, which I don't think they necessarily do, and I've argued this in earlier work, is that there aren't any other types of law that can exist, or even that state law is the most important form of law. That's when the problems start, I think. So if you're theorizing state law and just saying, look, this is division of labor, I can't do everything, I'm just going to do what's right in front of me. You can do that without making a further claim by saying, and this is the most important type of law, all sorts of law should conform to this or anything like that. And I think Raz found in some analytical jurisprudence that these types of claims were kind of implicit in what was going on. And that's where the critique comes out, I think, in Raz's later work on this. He says, we shouldn't have been so obsessed with the state. It was excusable to do it, but we shouldn't have gone on then to make this other claim that, this is the only type of law that exists, or even maybe the most important type of law. Of course, we can have a critique there as well. The fact that Hans Kelsen and H.L.A. Hart and others tried to give a definition of law, like a universal definition in all times and places, we can see perhaps an implicit conceptual imperialism there, even though they're not explicit about it. But yeah, I think maybe if we wanted to be more critical and less generous, we could say, well, the fact that you call this law and the fact that you're trying to provide an account of law in all times and places makes it difficult then to say, well, I'm just looking at state law, because you're sort of equating state law with law there, and not in the ecumenical way that I've outlined. But more importantly, of course, the disadvantage of weak and moderate pluralism and its basis in analytical jurisprudence is that it's, of course, radically under-inclusive. So if we take our conceptions or exemplars of law to be those that have developed in the modern state, then we're missing out on many other types of normative orderings that we as legal scholars, legal theorists, perhaps should be interested in and should be looking at. And these tools that have been developed, forged in the crucible of the development of the state, are likely to miss a lot of that. They're too blunt, and they only really capture this official form of institutional law with its separation of power, judiciary, legislature, and so on and so forth. The other problem with this weak and moderate pluralism conceptually is, of course, its imperial or ideological overtones. So there's a sense in which is quite it's a critique that's made that it wasn't just the case that they were developing these theories of law and the concept in the context of the development of the European state in particular, but that there was a sense in which this was the kind of apogee of legal development, and that the European nation state had developed the best form of law for the world, and Europe was shining a light, and it was for the rest of the world to come and follow this development. So there's potentially a problematic sense of progressiveness, which underpins weak and moderate pluralism. Two, which becomes very Eurocentric. Law is whatever the European state developed as law, which misses out, of course, on all the other experiences of all the other cultures and civilizations of the globe. We get this a little bit in some of the language that's used around this. For Hart, for example, where he talks about primitiveness in law. So I think this is a big problem, of course, with these types of law, to the extent to which that claim holds. The idea that this was not just a sort of cold-eyed, neutral, detached account of what law is, but also a sense of law is whatever the European state has developed, and it's for everybody else sort of to catch up. This kind of mission simulatrice idea, which is, of course, very problematic. I think Hart, in a way, did pick up on this a bit. I mean, he did towards in the concept of law say, look, you know, the type of legal system that I'm trying to track here can oppress and can be a big problem. I mean, he talked about simple or primitive legal system, which is, of course, very imperialistic. But, you know, he didn't make the point that this is not necessarily a good thing, right? And the type of law I'm capturing can be used to engage in oppression in a much more effective way than other types of legal systems. And this can be a big problem. So there is a nod to that, I think, in Hart that I just want to point out in that critique. But there's also another feature of this, I think, which we need to problematize and understand when we think about legal pluralism and the potential imperialism of analytical jurisprudence, if we want to put it that way. So one story is the stories I've just outlined. That look, these were people, you know, as we often hear today, they were a product of their time. This is what they were doing. Obviously, now in 2024, we need to update how we think about these things. And I think that's all true. I think, you know, we should be duly critical when it's appropriate, but we should also understand and extent that, you know, some of these authors were operating in certain contexts and they were the product of their time. But I think there's another impulse that pushes against legal pluralism, which doesn't capture that. And this is values that I think are really a major challenge for legal pluralism. And this is where I talked about, you know, pointing towards future research agendas. In many ways, if we take the state and take the modern European state and take that out and put in values, say, as democracy or the rule of law, we can see that there's a tension between these ideas, which most people want to promote, I think. I mean, and even in critics of analytical jurisprudence, don't necessarily want to do away with ideals of democracy, and they don't want to do away with ideals of the rule of law. But this is something that legal pluralism is difficult to reconcile, or so these values are difficult in many ways to reconcile with legal pluralism, because if we understand democracy as self-government, self-determination, and this Kantian idea of giving the law to ourselves, the only law that's valid is the law that we give to ourselves. If we have legal pluralism, then there's a question of the extent to which a political community is giving the law to itself, where there are multiple types of law or multiple legal systems applicable to that community, or maybe to sectors of that community. And so this pushes up against or creates a tension, I think, with the value of democracy. It also creates a tension with one of the core values of democracy, and one of the core values used to justify democracy, that is equality. So where we have in a legal pluralist universe, and you know, legal pluralism is celebrated in many different ways, rightly so, I think. But we also have to be aware of and think about the impact this has on other things that we might want in our societies, like political equality. So where I am subject to a certain type of law because of my religion or because of my background or something else, and you're subject to a different type of law, there is a question there for equality and political equality, and the equality of the state and the equality of our political communities. And this is something I think that in legal pluralism, we need to think a little bit more about in legal pluralist scholarship. So I think the next frontier, and I think the big questions for legal pluralism going forward, are really squaring the circle between these values. We want legal pluralism. Often it's considered to be a good thing for not only for analytical purposes, but also for normative purposes and the normative ends that legal pluralism can serve, which is implicit in those kind of state-based critiques of analytical jurisprudence. But we also usually in the same breath, in the same frame, want to promote ideals of democracy and other ideals such as equality and the rule of law. And I think we need to think harder and do more work about how we put those different values together. I'm not suggesting that there's an algorithm that can do that for us. I'm not suggesting that I have the answers, but I think it's something that perhaps we can bring more into the frame when we think about legal pluralism in legal theory. So that's my bit. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Cormac. This is really, really fascinating, and thank you for this extensive description of the state of art and legal pluralism, and your suggestion of these future trajectories. I would like to open it for.
So thanks for that. I agree about the division part, because it allows me to try to classify myself, and I think I end up being a moderate pluralist, grounded on Raz instead of heart. But I'm wondering about the kind of pluralism that Tamanaha is promoting, and how much, not only for Tamanaha, but I think that even for the opposite side of the spectrum, the conclusion of what counts as law, while it attempts to be descriptive and claims to be descriptive, is really the conclusion of what they want counted as law. That is, there's whatever social practice and I see this a lot in Canada, at least, with the question of Indigenous legal systems. You want certain practices to be granted a certain status. If you know that if you describe those practices as law, they will be granted a certain status that they would not be granted otherwise. I think that itself is a questionable presumption, and therefore you adjust your notion of legality in order to include this, which seems to be putting the cart before the horse. That is, it seems not to be analytic in the right way. And then, of course, there's two ways out of that. One is to say, well, yes, of course, yes, it isn't analytic in the right way, and we shouldn't do it. And the other way, I suppose, is to say, well, the emphasis on analytic clarity as opposed to normative recognition of other systems is wrong. We ought to be seeking to recognize social practices, and then, yeah. But I'm just wondering how the primacy of the analytic description or an analytic structure to define law comes before or after the desire to recognize particular social practices.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a really good question. So look, the way I would look at it would be to say it depends on what you're trying to do, right? It depends what your project is. So one is to say, look, Hans Kelsen's very clear, and he says, look, I'm just trying to put my finger on what law is, right? And I'm just not satisfied with all these people who mix it with sociology and people who mix it with morality and the whole natural law tradition. And that was very unsatisfactory for me. I'm in my medieval ivory tower, as it were, right? And I have a division of labor. It's my job as a scholar to kind of catalog what kind of world we're living in, right? And this is something I'm trying to pick out as pure scholarship, right? And if it has utility down the line for whoever, that's fine. But that's not really what I'm trying to do. And maybe that's a bit ingenuous to be that kind of ivory tower, kind of hermetically sealed, but you can see there's a logic to that, right? And there's a project there, and so on the one hand, that's where the analytical point comes in. You're saying, okay, well, I'm trying to figure this out in an analytical sense, so that this is how I approach the question. The other one is to say, well, there's a politics of naming around law, right? And say, look, the whole thing, we can't be naive and think there is a politics around this, and classifying something as law is like a political claim. It's a political move. Denying something the status of law is also a political move. And I think we can see that as a kind of a separate project, because you can say, okay, but this is really it's actually a politics of recognition, right? It's trying to get recognition for, your community or your whatever it is you're trying to do. And there, I think, obviously, as I suggest, the analytical point is a little less important, because it's really about recognition. It's about political recognition. And I think my answer to that would be, but it's important that we understand that that's the kind of conversation we're having, right? And this is what we're trying to do. And to understand ourselves as making political claims of recognition and why that's important. But I think even implicitly there's questions about the relationship between law and authority, right? Which Raz obviously would be interested in, and saying, you know, this is important for us that this is considered law because of law's connection to authority, and because we think often of law as a form of authority. But I think more than the analytical point, the real question there, it's a political claim, and that's how we should understand those types of conversations. So I didn't want to suggest that I think there's a priority between the analytical and the political at all. I just wanted to highlight the strengths and weaknesses of each, and maybe with a view to trying to better understand what kinds of projects they are, what kinds of discussions they are, to get better clarity on what's going on there. Yeah.
Thank you. Just have a similar question about this idea of this normative inquiry, because I mean, you say like when we do legal theory, we want to promote values like the rule of law, equality. So, however, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. Like when people ask about North Korea as a state, it's law. Namibia has a slavery. No one, or Saudi Arabia discriminate women, but no one says it's not law. So sometimes the question is just to say, you know, this. So one example that I have in mind is one colleague of Professor Muñiz Fraticelli is FARC, for example. So FARC created legal systems, and I mean, and we have to recognize that they do so. You know, like the dog principle: quack like a dog, flies like a dog, swims like a dog. It is a dog. That's it. So if we don't do it with the state, so what is the problem with do it with non-state entities like FARC, ISIS? They impose rules, levy taxes, build roads, all of that. So that's my question.
Oh, Jorge, you always ask me really difficult questions. So for the audience, Jorge did a commentary on my book, and yeah, asked me some of the most difficult questions in that session. Yeah, look, I mean, this goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about the kind of, you know, politics of recognition. And if I can clarify sort of my research point at the end of my talk was, there is a sense in a lot of legal pluralist literature that, when I read it, at least, I have a sense that legal pluralism is not just an analytical project. It's also a normative project, right? We should be all legal pluralists because, again, this goes back to the recognition point, right? There are lots of important forms of recognition that we associate with designating something as law or not law, and that has a normative. There's a value there in legal pluralism that's beyond just the purely epistemic, right? The purely kind of analytical in that sense. And so that's really what I was tapping into there, getting that sense of, you know, legal pluralism is a good thing, right? This is what we should be doing. There's a value here. And I think that's true, but I think we need to also recognize that it's complex because there are other values too, right? And that they're not all, I mean, I should come out of the closet. I'm kind of actually a Dworkinian, which kind of goes against what I'm saying here, but there's a sense that, you know, these may be conflict. I mean, Dworkin, of course, doesn't think they do, but, you know, there are other shows in time, right? There's equality, there's democracy, there are these other things. And we need to think about that when we kind of promote legal pluralism as a value, right? Not just in purely analytical terms, but also as a value. We need to bear that in mind, because in a lot of legal pluralist literature, there's a lot of critique and there's a lot of kind of celebration of legal pluralism. And my point is just to say, yes, but it's also complicated, right? It's not that simple that we just say that is a situation. So going to the point about what, you know, this also then falls down our conception of law, right? So if you think of law as in, you know, Kelsen and Hart and the moderate pluralists, yeah, I would say FARC as a legal system, the Mafia as a legal system, North Korea as a legal system, and that's not a problem. Right, that's just the way the world is. Just lots of legal systems, right? Which is, you know, this kind of very austere conception of, you know, as legal positivist as you can get kind of version of law, and perhaps disingenuously, I think, ignores the kind of moral noise around law, the moral atmosphere around law, if we can call it that, the sense in which law kind of makes implicit claims to legitimacy in some way that Arto's kind of there. I mean, he does talk about it at points. You know, David Deisenhouse's work, I think, brings this out really well. But someone like Dworkin just goes the whole hog and say, yeah, of course, it's all about legitimacy. It's always been about legitimacy, right? And we need to be upfront about that. And when we're talking about political legitimacy in law, then how on earth can FARC have a legal system? How on earth can FARC have law? How on earth can North Korea have law? Because law is essentially a normative discourse of political legitimacy. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it depends on how convincing you think a very austere positivism can be. Whether, you know, Kelsen and Hart can claim to have that really arm's length relationship with morality and with normative considerations, or whether that's disingenuous. And once we start talking about law, we're, as Dworkin would say, we're always already in some sort of normative domain. And you're being disingenuous if you can say, I can stand, you know, Dworkin famously talks about this Archimedean viewpoint, which he completely rejects. He thinks we're always already swimming in the sea of kind of normative ideals, and law is part of that story. And so we need to recognize that. And so on his view, he would reject the kind of contentions that FARC has a legal system because it doesn't make claims, it can't make plausible claims to political legitimacy, right? I mean, I have my own answer to that, but I guess it's important that we recognize and we are skeptical, or we problematize this austere kind of positivist view, because that's implicit in your point, right? That there is always bubbling beneath the surface some claim to legitimacy and authority here. That it's not just saying, oh, these are rules and these are normative practices, and that, you know, that's good. They can be evil or they can be great. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cormac. That was really, really interesting. And in the interest of time, I think I'm going just to wait my presentation, just to have for Orlando have enough time to present. So please, Orlando, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you also to the other speakers, of course, for their great interventions. What I'm going to discuss is what we call in Europe constitutional pluralism specifically, and to use Cormac's labels is a very weak form of pluralism because it involves, on the one hand, the member states of the European Union, and on the other, these highly institutionalized non-state system, supranational system, which is the EU. I will be, to some extent, oversimplifying because the legal scenario is more complex than that. There's, for instance, the system of the European Convention on Human Rights, which I will not discuss, but considering the power they're capable of projecting, these are, I believe, the two main actors to focus on. Member states on the one hand and the EU on the other. I must also say that what I will be talking about, at least at the beginning during the next 5 minutes or so, for people who are a bit acquainted with this debate, will be quite trivial. But on the other hand, I realize that I'm addressing a mostly non-European audience, so I cannot take a series of things for granted. So what I will be doing in the next 5 minutes is a sort of crash course in EU con law. Someone like Cormac knows it very well. I apologize. Go get a coffee. See you in 5. So let's start from really the basics. Then I will try to say something maybe more interesting and perhaps innovative at the end. Let's start from the basics. What is this coexistence of levels of governance altogether that is so interesting for us, at least? Well, on the one hand, we have, of course, the states that have crowded the continent for centuries, and they are states in a very normal, very ordinary sense, in both international law sense and in a constitutional law sense. Fair enough. On the other hand, we have a very complex institution which has been developing now for decades, since the 50s. And it has become, I would say, hardly recognizable if compared today to what it used to be in 54 or 57. Why so? Well, the origins of this project are those of a form of economic integration, market integration. We will integrate markets of the founding states first and then of the states that joined later to reinforce their economies and to strengthen also political ties. This meant simply allowing some central institutions to govern the free circulation of the factors of production that you need for any market, so goods, services, workers, and capitals. And that was that. In time, this creature has grown and it governs a series of areas that are very remote, or to some extent at least remote from the single market. Data protection is today vastly centralized in Europe. The regulation of the AI is centralized, is being produced at the center right now. Monetary policy is centralized for most of the vast majority of the population and GDP of the continent. Even areas like migration and asylum law are to a lesser extent centralized. So one thing that has changed and is important to understand for than what I will be saying later is the areas, what we call the competences, the material areas that are governed in Brussels right now are incomparably larger than what they used to be at the beginning. On top of that, and perhaps most importantly from our point of view, and to explain why we talk about constitutional pluralism, the legal nature of this institution has shifted. The basics are those of an international organization, there's no doubt about that. You look at the basic foundational documents, legal documents, those are treaties of international law, signed and ratified by its member states. But if you look at the content of these treaties and the governance that follows, a significant amount of that has the characteristics of a constitutional system in a very, again, trivial sense, in a very, you could go back to the French Declaration of 1789, a society which has no guarantee of powers, no guarantee of rights and separation of powers, has no constitution. Look at the system of governance of the EU today and see how several principles deriving from that definition of constitutionalism have been transposed, or at least have been claimed to have been transposed at the EU level, because these adds considerable legitimacy to the project. There is a Charter of Fundamental Rights, as we speak, which is legally binding. Before that, there was a set of general principles, unwritten general principles, whose content was practically the same as that of the Charter today. There is a system of governance which, let's say, tries to mimic that of a state to some extent. There is a parliament which is directly elected. There's a council which resembles to some extent the German Bundesrat, so a chamber of the states in a federal system. There is a commission which mimics, again, to some extent, a government. There is an independent judiciary with powers of adjudication and so on. So several principles taken from state constitutionalism have been transposed with varying degrees of success at the level of the EU. This is the first thing to understand, to realize why we talk about constitutional pluralism rather than pluralism in a broader sense. The second point is that there are two enormously famous principles, structural principles of this polity, which make the likelihood of conflict between these two levels of government considerable. Those are, I've just said, enormously famous. They are in Europe, but again, I cannot assume that they are also outside. Those are the principles that we call direct effect and primacy. What does that mean? Direct effect is the principle according to which you can take the legal production, a large chunk of the legal production of this institution, so of the law that is produced in this system, and bring it to court in the member states. You can go, I live in Lisbon, I can go to the tribunal in Lisbon and say this treaty provision or this provision in an EU regulation should be applicable immediately, here and now, which differentiates the EU from most international organizations. You don't necessarily need that the system produced at international level is internalized, is transposed internally. A large chunk of it, you can bring it yourself in court. And the second principle is that of the famous or infamous system of primacy. When the norms produced in the system conflict with those of the member states, they prevail. So primacy is a polite way of saying supremacy. I will be elaborating on the following proposition in a moment, but follow me for a second. In principle, these applies also to the constitutions of the member states entirely. I will return to that in a moment. Now, one interesting thing is that there is a certain similarity between the scenario that follows from this evolution of the system of the EU and a federal institution. I'm taking here a relatively famous definition of federalism, the one by Daniel Arbestam in the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Constitutional Law. He says federalism is the coexistence within a compound polity of multiple levels of government, each with constitutionally grounded claims to some degree of organizational autonomy and jurisdictional authority. There is more than a bell that rings here. I'm not saying that it is a federal state, not by a mile, but there's a part of the system of the EU which is deeply inspired by the principles of federalism. Now, given this scenario, what are the problems that follow? The problem is that the existence of an institution that mimics the state, including their source of legitimacy considerably, and that then has vast areas of competence, even on sensible topics, and it, on top of that, claims primacy, claims supremacy over your internal law, including your constitutional law, ends up at some point clashing with the constitutions of the member states. I've just said that the principle of primacy theoretically applies entirely to the constitutions of the member states. I should say that this absolute primacy is only accepted at the EU level. Practically no member state accepts it unconditionally. At the member state level, we have what we call conditional primacy. So yes, we do recognize that this creation that we ourselves made prevails in principle, otherwise it wouldn't be able to function, but there are reservations. When there is no agreement on the legitimacy, on the legality of these reservations, we have conflicts. And this is the problem we are facing. We have been facing perhaps always, but we are facing with far more intensity right now. The fact that these two polities that in a sense mirror each other, insist on the same population at the same time on the same territory, and at times will conflict in their commands. There are three main forms of conditions posited at the state level, which again are not recognized as such at the EU level. One is the recognition of the fundamental rights as established in the national constitution. This is the very first objection which was made already in the 70s by the Germans and Italians. Well, let's say this is the most of the three, the most harmless, let's say, because the existence of a more or less broadly comparable system of fundamental rights at the EU level has more or less immunized the debate from possibility, the context from the possibility of conflicts based on divergence on fundamental rights. Not entirely, but it has become surely less likely. And then there's the other two, which are more interesting and more debated right now. One is the notion of so-called ultra vires. The idea, in other words, that national institutions can check whether this creature is overstepping. You can regulate a series of areas that have been conferred to you explicitly. The moment you go beyond, we have the power to check. This is a German creation originally. For the first time, this idea was advanced in the Maastricht Urteil, the judgment of the German Constitutional Court on Germany's participation to the Maastricht Treaty in 1993. And from there, it has spread considerably. To this day, the cases of most outspoken opposition between the member states and the EU have been justified with this argument. We are checking that the EU institutions are not going too much beyond their powers. There has been a Czech case in 2012, a Danish case in 2016, a German one, perhaps the most famous in 2020, and then a Polish one in 2021. It might be interesting to notice that these were judicial conflicts, and in 3 out of 4 cases, the Czech, the German, and the Danish case, political institutions, which means parliaments and governments of the member states, did their best to solve this because, of course, you have very little incentive that this guerre de juge escalates too much. There is too much to gain. In the end, they believe in participating rather than in engaging in a continuous clash. Of the 4, the only case in which this was not true, the political institutions did not jump in to try to solve the conflict, is that of Poland, but that was a very, and to some extent still is, a very problematic context with a very Eurosceptic government in place at the time. It has been ousted last year, which was actively looking for conflict for reasons of internal politics. The last set of objections which can create conflict go these days under the label constitutional identity. So it's not necessarily the fact that we have a series of fundamental rights that we want to be respected. It's not necessarily the fact that you overstepped. It's just that there are structures, constitutional specificities that we are not ready to abandon. This was a theoretical notion which has been ongoing, the idea of constitutional identity, since Weimar's Germany, but then was a bit neglected. It was rediscovered first with a decision of the French Constitutional Council in 2005, and then most notably, again, thanks to the decision of the German Constitutional Court in 2009 on Germany's accession to the current treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. From then on, from there on, it has spread considerably. I've been studying this recently, and there are many states that today justify exceptions to the application of EU law based on the notion of constitutional identity. Germany does that, Belgium as well, France, Italy, Spain, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and most likely I'm missing something. The interesting thing is that this label is in a sense similar to the one of constitution of ultra vires. The label is the same, but then if you look at the context, it's extremely different. Poland was, as I was mentioning, very different from Germany, or the Czech Republic, or Denmark. Similarly, they all talk about their identity, but then if you look at what they're protecting with their identity, the differences are glaring. Germany or Belgium will try to ensure, perhaps Italy as well, a higher level of protection for some fundamental rights. If you look at France, the time they invoked it, it was the opposite. They had reasons of collective security, which convinced them that they had to disapply a higher level of protection, of data protection, coming from the EU for reasons of collective security. And then you look at Poland, it was the political conflict I was mentioning before, which motivated its use. You look at Bulgaria, it was to preserve a very idiosyncratic constitutional specificity deriving from their history and their religious tradition, most importantly. As a result, and I will end here, we have a highly complex system which is very invasive, which we cannot fully do without, because there's a shared feeling that doing without is worse than having it. But on the other hand, there is not either a full reconciliation with the idea that the intrusion at the constitutional level will be and is significant, and that, you know, if you want to still be a member state and don't accept absolute primacy, at some point you are almost destined to clash with the central level. So we live, as it were, in a system of structural conflict. All right, I hope this was clear. I'm not 100% sure, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Orlando, for your presentation and for introducing us to a different aspect of legal pluralism, which is the pluralism within the European Union. So let's open it for questions.
Oh yeah, thanks. I'm being very old school. I can't find the raise hand function on Zoom, so I'm literally raising my hand. Thanks, Orlando. I just have a question about what you think supremacy or primacy really is in the EU context, because there's different ways to think about it. So for those of you not, I mean, Mexico's a federal state, right? So you have this tension between the federal units and the center, and that's always the case in these kind of two-level systems. But I think in the EU context, it's almost fetishized in some ways, perhaps because of the kind of way the EU is kind of still a polity in development. So but like one way to think of it is to say, you know, look, this is just a conflicts rule. In any system of two-tier governance, you're always going to have conflict. So this is just a way, you know, we don't need to dramatize it, as Barnier talked about the Irish border and Brexit, right? It's just a simple conflicts rule. All legal systems have conflicts rules. This is a conflicts rule, right? It's not always followed, but hey, that's not a problem, because not all laws always followed all the time. So that's no biggie, right? It's just a conflict rule. It works most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't. Who cares? Let's not make a drama out of this. So that's one story you can have of primacy. The other one is to say, no, primacy is a political claim. It's a claim to ultimate authority, always, in every case, and all of the time. And that's a different story, because I think once you start thinking about it in terms of authority, or an authority claim, all the kind of anxieties come out, right? So if the authority of the EU is challenged, then it could all fall apart, because this is the existential nightmare behind every EU legal scholar's thought, right? The EU is fragile, it's precarious, must be protected. It could fall apart at any time, right? So they kind of, I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course, a little bit, but so the idea here is, if we think of primacy as a political claim where it's challenged, it's a big problem, because the system is so delicate that it could fall apart if it's in any way challenged. And I think, I mean, this is why I'm interested to hear your opinion about it, that for my money, you know, the EU is quite resilient, and it's really not as delicate and fragile as many EU legal scholars, in my view, think it is. I mean, I wrote this piece called Eppure esiste. I don't know if you've seen it, where I say, you know, notwithstanding all these crises, eppure esiste, you know, channeling Galileo, right? It's still there. It's a lot more resilient than we think it is. And maybe this speaks to the nature of primacy as a kind of a boring conflicts rule, and not this be all and end all political authority claim that if it's challenged, the whole thing is going to fall apart tomorrow. So I'd be just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, legally, I think we can all agree it's a conflict rule and nothing more, and it's not particularly different from similar conflict rules in composite polities elsewhere. I guess that part of the problem is how it was born, which again, for non-Europeans, is out of thin air. It was created at some point in the case of the Court of Justice of the European Union, and attempts to codify it. It has happened one with the Constitutional Treaty 2004-2005, showed how contentious it was in the public opinion, because that was one of the many reasons why that treaty amendment, vast treaty reform actually, failed in France and the Netherlands, because some Eurosceptics politicians mobilized that very symbolic clause and said, that means the end of our state. That means the end of our sovereignty. Of course, I'm oversimplifying, but it was one of the reasons used to ensure the failure of the treaty. So it was born without the legitimacy, let's say the clearness of a codified rule, and it was never possible to do it later. So I guess this is part of the historical reasons that justify the anxiety you were referring to. And then the other part is probably, let's say, the other side of the same debate, which is again a political rather than legal debate. I agree that it is more resilient than it seems, but there is a strong habit among Eurosceptic politicians to use it as a boogeyman, and as a reaction, the fear among many that at some point these people might be taken seriously until the fall of the entire project. Now, I must say, after Brexit, especially after Brexit, I'm not entirely sure how strong this tendency still is, because even the most Eurosceptic politicians in the Netherlands or Italy as well, most likely in France very soon, they don't talk about leaving anymore. But there's probably a sort of Pavlov's dog's reflex that's stuck in many people, that we really need to protect this thing because it is very, very, very fragile. Although perhaps you're right, it's not as fragile as it used to be anymore. So I would say one is probably a question of legitimacy, how this thing developed in the first place, which creates this tension, this tendency in trying to defend it come what may. And the other one is the political debate, which is to some extent still ongoing. But it's a very complex debate, of course.
I have a small curiosity on the idea of constituent power, which is one of the basic ideas. We're talking about constitutionalism and where is the European as a constitutionalism. But a great deal of the debates you're mentioning about supremacy, constitutional identity, presupposes that there is a constituent power, that someone can claim we do the constitution. And a great deal of the Eurosceptic opposition, like in Germany, like, no, we are the genuine demos. The other is not a demos. Or the European is not a demos. We have this. So, but they are not willing to recognize sometimes like subnational demos, no, like Catalonia. That's not demos. That's not really. So, like, is there a role for constituent power in European constitutionalism? Can we have like allegiances to, like, I don't know, like have like my constituent power as a French citizen, but one as an European? Do they clash? So if you have, I'm curious if you have any take on that constitutional concept.
Probably I'm going to say something a bit unpopular now, but I'm not a big fan of the notion of constituent power in the first place. It was a very ideological tool of the French Revolution, mobilized for very specific reasons to legitimize a radical overhaul of the system back in the days, and from then on it has been mobilized consistently in the same way. I think it's a myth that there is a foundational moment of that kind, which is at the basis of the legal system, or there is no constitutional legitimacy at all. That said, there is a sociological problem and political problem indeed, which is the extreme diversity of the 27. People in Portugal identify themselves as Portuguese to begin with, and French as French, and Italians, and then maybe later as Europeans, which of course makes enormously more difficult the cooperation and makes the legitimacy of the institution weaker. But per se, the fact that there is limited space for the notion of constituent power doesn't bother me particularly. But I realize that this is a bit controversial, and I respect opposite opinions on that, definitely.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I think we are almost without time. And what's going on? I just want to have like the last word of what we try to do and what I think we have achieved. My original plan was to invite a couple of friends to comment on the idea, hope I'm sharing the right thing. So, of sorry, what's going on legal pluralism and jurisprudence, and we have this agenda. And I have one talk that I could easily summarize in just one question. So the idea was to bring some of the people working on the state of the art of legal pluralism. We have here Professor Muñiz Fraticelli's book. We have Cormac's book. We have Alex Green and Jennifer Hendry, who couldn't join us. We have Orlando's book here. And what the idea is like, what is to offer and what is there's a challenge. I would book a book of mine, but I don't have one. So that's part of the problem. Yet, so and I had a talk, but it could be summarized in just one question, which is, it's actually, I had slides and everything. Is this, my point was very simple. I just want to say it, so it's there, is that Griffiths, the original debate says that legal pluralism talk about there is more than one thing, one law. Okay, what is this one law? And if you look at the legal pluralist literature, they talk about one legal system, one legal regime, one legal space. What do they mean? I think I have a formulation of the problem, and I have an answer, but that will wait for a different occasion, because I think we're out of time, and I would like to respect that, even though we start a bit late. So I would like to thank and in the spirit of Cormac's. So we have had 3 different presentations on 3 different aspects of this general phenomenon that is called legal pluralism. That is it challenges to some extent the state-centric assumptions of jurisprudence, and there are different agendas and approaches. The relationship between legal pluralism, moral pluralism, and political pluralism, and how it's instantiated in different practices, such as universities, the future agenda, the connection between legal pluralism, and how it forces us to reconstruct at least the traditional debate between I don't know, legal positivists and legal non-positivists, as it was evidenced in Cormac's presentation. So, for example, while here's one very particular personal take on this. While there is this obsession in intramural debates, the hard-working debate, the hard-fuller debate, or even more sophisticated versions of inclusive, exclusive, over-exclusive, and under-exclusive legal positivism. So we have these debates. For example, is FARC legal system? So we have this while people are being focused on these intramural debates, there is this whole phenomenon and this interaction between legal orders, and they regulate some of the most important and urgent aspects of humanity, from migration, from climate change, which are not state norms. Sometimes we are fixated in this small thing. We have been forgetting that aspect. And we have also this constitutional aspect about how traditional notions such as constitution, constitutional power, constituent power, and actually arise in the different interactions between polities or legal orders. And this is the reflection I wanted to have for this conference. One of the goals of the Mexican Conference of Legal Philosophy is to highlight the paradigms that we should be working in legal philosophy, and I think this is definitely one, and I think we have done some progress today while working towards that goal. So it's 2 p.m. in my time, so it's just like sharp on time, and I would like to thank Professor Muñiz Fraticelli, Professor Scarcello, Professor Cormac, Amhlaigh for being here, and to thank the audience. I will leave it now to Enrique for the last words of the jornadas. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jorge, for organizing this extraordinary workshop and the talks of our colleagues. Thank you very much. Bien, pues no me queda más que decir que ha sido una jornada extraordinaria, de un alto nivel. Se han discutido temas muy interesantes. Creo que hay varios puntos sugerentes para futuras investigaciones. Como ha señalado Jorge, la idea de promover dentro de las jornadas paradigmas emergentes creo que se ha visto satisfecha. Hablamos de neurociencias y derecho, hablamos de inteligencia artificial, de pluralismo, en fin. Creo que quedaron apuntadas muchas líneas para seguir construyendo. Y en este punto, pues no me queda más que agradecerles a todos los que han estado atendiéndonos a lo largo de esta semana Y desde luego, gracias a las personas que no se ven, pero que están detrás y que hacen posible esto, a el área de eventos del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas, por su apoyo en la difusión y transmisión del evento, concretamente a Alejandra Caballero, a Edna Peña, a Gerardo Campos, a mis asistentes Eric Galicia, a Paola Moreno, a alguien de quien sin duda alguna no hubiera sido posible, que siempre ha estado con nosotros desde el inicio, a la doctora Carmen Patricia López Olvera, y desde luego, muy especialmente al coorganizador de este evento, mi querido amigo Jorge Fabra, por todo el apoyo que nos brindó, así como a Gonzalo Villarrosas, por haber contribuido a elevar la internacionalización de nuestras jornadas. Pues sin más, les mando un abrazo muy fuerte a todos y quedamos ya emplazados para las jornadas del año que entra. Muchísimas gracias. Que les vaya a todos muy bien.